Effects of increasing minimum wage.
By Dalton Morgan.
Daniel Weinberg.
Ajay Perez.
To what extent does increasing the minimum wage affect jobs, citizens, and society in Florida? The effects of increasing minimum wage can be positive and negative depending on the rate at which it is increased. It could positively affect economic inflation, create more productive members of society, and can lower the cost of living. It can also negatively affect economic growth rate and decrease employment rate.
Let us begin with the effects that minimum wage has on the economy. What is minimum wage? Minimum wage is the minimum price that an employee can be paid hourly. Increasing minimum wage could positively or negatively affect the economy. With increasing minimum wage comes inflation. Inflation is a general increase in prices and fall in purchasing value of money. The reason inflation occurs when increasing minimum wage is explained in the article, Does Raising Minimum Wage Increase Inflation? By Adam Hayes. It states, in theory, raising the minimum wage forces business owners to raise the price of their goods or services, thereby spurring inflation. This statement from a first-hand perspective in the economic industry that will be affected by inflation and minimum wage goes to show why inflation happens when minimum wage is increased. When minimum wage increases, businesses lose money because they have to pay their workers more. So in order to prevent that loss of income, they raise the price of their goods and services, and this ultimately makes the currency used in that area less valuable. In the graph shown, it shows that when the red line, which represents minimum wage, increases rapidly, the blue line, which represents inflation, also begins to increase rapidly, showing the relationship that minimum wage has with inflation. Next slide. However, inflation isn't always bad, but also isn't always good. Inflation can be good or bad, depending on the rate that inflation is increased at. If the minimum wage is increasing at an unstable rate, causing inflation to also increase at an unstable rate, it can hurt the economy. If it's increasing at a slow, stable rate, then it could positively impact the economy. Inflation can affect the cost of living, the cost of doing business, borrowing money, mortgages, corporate and government bond yields, and every other facet of the economy, as explained in the article, Inflation and Economic Recovery by Mark Davis. This shows that inflation has a very big role and weight on the economy to either help it or hurt it. It could lower economic growth rate, increase costs of imported goods, and lower levels of investment, as well as maintain business profits, encourage lending and borrowing, and boost economic growth. Next slide.
Furthermore, increasing the minimum wage in Florida will result in an increased rate of unemployment. With businesses expected to pay an increased salary to lower level workers, many of these workers would be laid off from their jobs due to financial setbacks. According to Jack Kelly, CEO of one of the largest global career search firms, employers, especially small family and mid-sized businesses, will be disproportionately hurt by the extra costs incurred. The local neighborhood stores and businesses with razor-thin profits will be forced to raise prices to make up for the additional labor costs. With the increased prices, customers may elect to take their business elsewhere. This means that these businesses will lose customers, and losing customers means losing income, which could result in these businesses having to lay off workers. As shown in the real minimum wage rate versus the unemployment rate graph to the right, where the red line shows the minimum wage rate and the blue line shows the overall unemployment rate, as the minimum wage rate increases, the overall unemployment rate increases as well. Next slide. Moreover, increasing the minimum wage would also result in reduced hours for workers. Ryan Bourne, who has a Master of Philosophy in Economics from the University of Cambridge, states employers may elect to cut hours across the board for everyone. Whichever way the employer goes, some of the workers would be in a worse situation than before. Also, as a real-world example of this happening, in 2016, Seattle increased their state minimum wage to $15 per hour. This resulted in Seattle workers being given, on average, 20% fewer hours and experiencing a net loss in pay. As shown in the minimum wage rate versus the quantity of hours chart to the right, as the minimum wage rate increases, the quantity of hours given to workers decreases proportionately. Next slide.
In contrast, an increase in minimum wage would pull workers out of poverty. It is explained by David Cooper in his article that a lack of change in the minimum wage since the 20th century has forced already hardworking, low-income workers to work even harder for a wage that has not been adjusted for today's standards. However, as you can see on this graph, the blue dotted line represents an increase in the minimum wage. This increase would pull families out of poverty by bringing minimum wage earnings above the poverty line for a family of 3. Increasing the minimum wage would also increase the quality of life for low-income workers. In a paper by Patrick Flavin and Gregory Schufelt, they investigated the effects of a minimum wage increase on individual workers' SWB, or subjective well-being. Not only did the paper find that a higher minimum wage allowed workers to spend more freely and improve their quality of life, but also that higher wages made workers feel more secure and satisfied with their jobs. This, by extension, benefits society as well because the more people that are satisfied with their jobs and quality of life, the better off the community is as a whole. An increase in minimum wage would also create more productive workers. In a discussion paper by Haijin Q, he analyzes the difference in worker effort relative to an increase in minimum wage. He found that when minimum wage was increased, workers who were less productive were at risk of falling below the minimum wage, which caused these workers to increase productivity to avoid discharge. Additionally, in another paper by John Schmidt, he analyzed employment effects of an increased minimum wage. It found that a higher wage made it easier to recruit and retain workers, thus having little effect on employment. As seen on this graph to the right, an increase in minimum wage split over 3 years between 2006 and 2009, as seen in the second column, would have a smaller impact on wage cost increases as opposed to previous years. This shows that if done correctly, a minimum wage increase would have little effect on wage costs and thus little effect on employment.
With the increase of the minimum wage in Florida, the quality of life has been affected because it results in job losses and income inequality. Family and small businesses in Miami experience different living costs than those in New York City, where the cost of living is 30.2% higher. The business groups across Florida oppose the increase, saying it will put a strain on the state's trust economy and cost hundreds of thousands of jobs. The picture shows the amount of jobs that will be affected by Florida's Amendment 2. It also shows the amount of teenagers that will be affected by the amendment. Next slide. Florida's Amendment 2 will raise Florida's minimum wage gradually over the next 6 years. Under the 6-year phase-in, minimum wage will go up to $10 an hour starting next year, followed by a $1 per hour. Future increases would then return to be adjusted starting in 2027. This will affect the economy and environment as it will lead to many issues like inflation and income inequality. Next slide. In order for an increased minimum wage in Florida to be beneficial, the implementation of the increase of minimum wage should be gradual over a long period of time. If the minimum wage were to be increased from around $8 per hour to $15 per hour without time for Florida's economy to adapt, there may be serious issues regarding unemployment, business closing down, inflation, and the general economy of Florida. Although if the minimum wage were to be increased incrementally over several years, many benefits would sprout, such as an increase in buying power for the less wealthy people.
What questions do you have?
All right, thank you. I will have questions for everybody. Sorry, I'm just working with the computer here. All right, so first question will be for Dalton. So go ahead and unmute yourself, Dalton. Describe how the content of the presentation changed as a result of you guys talking about it.
So at first we were thinking about doing the pros of minimum wage increase, and then we were thinking about doing the cons of minimum wage increase, and then we just ultimately decided to do the pros and the cons, and then come up with a conclusion at the end.
All right. Kevin, you're up next. In what way did you improve your ability to work with a group as a result of this project?
So through this project, I learned that in order to work with a group, a level of flexibility has to be maintained. Since we both had pros originally, we both had pros. Like some of us has pros for increasing minimum wage, and some of us had negatives for increasing minimum wage. So by working together, we like found a solution that binded those the what we wrote together to show that it can be pros or negatives depending on the rate that is being increased.
All right, thanks. Daniel, you're up next. What is an example of an argument from one of your peers' reports that you decided not to use in your presentation?
So one example was one of the arguments that Kevin used. He said that increasing the minimum wage would have a negative impact on quality of life for people because it would increase the minimum, like the minimum cost of living. And ultimately, we decided to exclude that because through our research and after we changed our presentation, we found that minimum wage can be changed, or like the effects of minimum wage, whether they're good or bad, depend on how fast it's increased. Like if you increase it too much at a time, it'll have a negative effect, and if you increase it like little by little over a longer period of time, it'll have a positive effect. So we decided not to include it because it could swing both ways. Like it could either be true or false depending on like how fast you're increasing the minimum wage.
All right, thank you. And Isaiah, you're up last. Describe an argument from someone else in your group's reports that makes you think differently about your solution or conclusion. Actually, solution for you guys.
Well, inside Daniel's argument, I thought well the with the solution it made me think different about it be, about the solution we identified with because he wrote something like how good it was, and while I had like the cons of it, and I was um like I really didn't how would I put it in terms like I thought it'd be more of a negative like solution how we were gonna put it, but we put it more of like a more like better solution like with cons and stuff like that.